Hello everyone and welcome back to the program. In 2018, we passed a lot of important anniversaries. In November, the world remembered the armistice of 1918, the war that was supposed to end all wars. On today's program, we're going to talk about another war, a war that has been raging for more than a century, the war against biblical morality.
The Trumpet Daily.
In my father's Key of David television program in the United States, one that he gave back in early 2018 about Shakespeare and the British Empire, he said that Shakespeare wrote at a time when the British people were ardently devoted to the reading of the Bible. The reading of the Bible. Now, Shakespeare lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s. The King James Bible Project, that happened in the early 1600s as well. And all of this was long before the British Empire exploded onto the scene. But as my father explained in that program from early 2018, this was God getting the empire ready, or getting the British people ready for their empire. It was all prophesied. Notice that in Genesis chapter 35, Genesis 35 verse 10, it says, "And God said unto him, Your name is Jacob, your name shall not be called any more Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. And he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of you, and kings shall come out of your loins." So I don't have time to get into that particular prophecy in great detail, but you can certainly request the United States and Britain in prophecy if you'd like to study that further. But those blessings, those birthright blessings, came upon our peoples, the United States and Great Britain, beginning around the early 1800s. And you see this emerging superpower in the United States, and you see this empire develop on this little island. Notice what Herbert Armstrong said. This is in The Missing Dimension in Sex. He said, in my lifetime, now he lived in the late 1800s and all the way through most of the 1900s. He said, in my lifetime, we have whipped past the machine age, the automobile age, the jet age, the nuclear age, and the space age. What stimulated this accelerating materialistic development? He says, it occurred simultaneously with the sudden spurt to national wealth and power of two nations, Britain and the United States, beginning in 1800. It happened right around that time, beginning in 1800. Now here in Britain, Queen Victoria, she dominated that century, ascending to the throne in Britain when she was just a teenager, and her reign continued on for 63 years, carrying all the way through to the first year or two of the 20th century, 1901. And if you think about life in Britain, just to use Britain as our primary example here, if you think about life in Britain during the 1800s, in the home, when the home, it was like a sanctuary for the British people. And their discipline, what they taught to their children in school and at home, and how that they were taught to submit to orders, to follow instructions, and they weren't allowed to stray very far away from their parents. This is just a different time I'm describing. Work ethic, that was something that was really valued. History was something that the British people revered. They revered their own history. And as my father brought out in that Shakespeare program, they read their Bibles, and a lot of them took it literally. They applied it in a literal sense. This is life in Britain in the 1800s. It's not to say that it was perfect or that they were without sin, but what a difference when you just compare it to our time today. And is it just a coincidence that during this Victorian era, that's when the British Empire reached its high water mark? And then what happened after she died? What happened as we entered into the 20th century? As I said at the top of the program, we've been looking back on a lot of anniversaries, or we've been passing a lot of anniversaries that have caused us to look back, like to the end of World War I, the end of the Great War. Well, let's look back to that period and also consider some other dramatic changes that have been happening. Edward VII, he's the one that carried on after Victoria, and he was a very different monarch, to say the least. He got caught up into a lot of sins, womanizing, indolence, things like that. William Manchester, in his biography on Churchill, he said, before the Edwardian era, authors could assume for their readers to know Latin and the Bible. They just assumed. Before the Edwardian era, back in the Victorian era, it was assumed. So my father talked about Shakespeare and the Bible going back to the 1500s and the 1600s, and really that carried on through to the 1800s. Let me take you back to The Missing Dimension in Sex. This is the book, by the way, that we're going to be offering on today's program, free of charge, no cost, no follow-up, no obligation. But we'd like for you to have a free copy. If you haven't gotten this book already, make sure that you call our operators and request your free copy of Mr. Armstrong's work. It says, it occurred simultaneously, this is just to carry on with that last quote that I gave you, with the sudden spurt of national wealth and power of two nations, Britain and the United States, beginning in 1800. That's what we read before. But then it says further, with this suddenly acquired material wealth, our people became materialistically minded. So we received all of these blessings, all of this prosperity, and what did we do with it? Well, I want to take you over to Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, and see here what God warned the Israelites. This is an important warning from Moses to the people of Israel. He said to them, look, when you come into the promised land, you better be careful. You better be careful when you receive all of these blessings of abundance, because it really could cause you to relax morally. It could cause you to not look to God like you once did. This is a quote that I gave to you recently on another program. Again, this is Manchester talking about that time, the 1800s. The solid core of agreed religious belief was gone. This is actually talking about coming into the Edwardian era, the early 1900s. He says the Bible had lost its grip on Englishmen. People were groping for a substitute. The new vogues were popular psychology, pragmatism, and Nietzscheanism. Fruits of inventive genius promised more excitement to come, but the cumulative effect of all this change, which should have broadened the human vision, gave men a sense of confinement and helplessness. All of these advancements, it should have broadened their thinking. But it didn't. It didn't. It just gave men a sense of confinement and helplessness. How sad, really. This is Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 7. For the Lord your God brings you into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills. And can't we say that about our land as well? Whether it's Great Britain or the United States, God brought us into a good land, to say the least. All of the blessings, all of the prosperity. That's not to say we haven't had to fight for our freedoms and for this prosperity, but look at what God just gifted to us. He gave it all to us. And what have we done? Verse 11, it says, beware, here's the warning, beware that you forget not the eternal your God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command you this day, lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when your herds and flocks multiply, it says, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the eternal your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. This is what often happens when we fight through a time of trial and test, and then we come through it and we relax. We relax, we let down, we let our guard down, we forget God, we stop crying out to God. Now look back over the past century. You can go back to, again, just to use World War I as an example. That war really did transform the course of the geopolitical order for sure, and it wreaked havoc upon our nations. Even though we came out victorious, in a lot of ways it was a loss, certainly for Great Britain, but just the devastating impact that it had on the morale, on family, on wealth. It says here in The Missing Dimension in Sex, once again, in the wake of World War I, the agitation resulting from Freud's revolutionary conclusions finally brought about the toppling of the legal barriers. So what Mr. Armstrong's writing about here in The Missing Dimension in Sex is that in addition to all of these massive changes brought on by not just one world war, but two, it also triggered a revolution in moral attitudes and social values, that kind of thing. And he says here in The Missing Dimension that the legal barriers came down after World War I, and it used to be that you really didn't have, literature out there, magazines, books, or whatever, on the subject of sex. That was just sort of kept off in a corner somewhere. But here the legal barriers come down, it says, and the moral barriers began breaking down simultaneously. With the removal of legal restraints against sex instruction, medical doctors and psychoanalysts began grinding out volume after volume, imparting heretofore banned instruction about sex. You couldn't even get into it before that World War I period. But what has that information taught us? Well, as Mr. Armstrong explains, and you can see it in the title there, there's a missing dimension. Sure, scientists and psychologists and them, they may have a lot of physical details, right, I suppose, but they don't understand the God-ordained purpose for marriage, for family, for sex. They don't know about the missing dimension. This goes on to say, the world began throwing off the restraints. The revolt was on against prudery, repression, and ignorance. The new sensual knowledge, with its most needed dimension missing, quickly began to be gulped in by curiosity-hungry minds. The young people of today have little awareness of the sex and family conditions in pre-war years. In fact, until 1914, so that takes you back to the World War I era, until 1914, there had been little basic change for some 4,000 years. Now, one of the things Mr. Armstrong talks about in this book is how that before that period, you had the old morality, which certainly isn't of God either, not teaching your children, just not saying anything about these subjects of why sex, why marriage, and so on. But then when you swing from that extreme over to the new morality, well, that's like leaping from the frying pan into the fire. One final bit here. He says, the prior to 1914 years were as different from today's world as day is from night. It is not only a moral revolution, a revolution in government, in economics, in science, in technology, in education, in labor standards, and in social values, even in religion. It's shaken, he says, the whole world. The whole world is in revolt. That's what he's talking about here. Make sure that you get your copy of The Missing Dimension in Sex. Together with this book, we're going to offer No Freedom Without Law. It's been a while since we've offered this booklet. And then also Character in Crisis. These two booklets are wonderful companions. Character in Crisis and No Freedom Without Law. And here's the new issue of our Trumpet magazine. As I've been saying on recent programs, if you subscribe to the Trumpet, and again, there's no subscription price, but you can subscribe today and get this in your mailbox every month. And as many of you now know, our Trumpet subscribers, they're the ones that we invite to our public Bible lectures. We had one in London recently. We have one coming up in Belfast in January. And then another one in Glasgow. We hope to plan that one in mid-March sometime. So we are working to get out and about so that we can meet some of you, our viewers, and some of you, our Trumpet readers. So stay tuned for the information that you need and request the free material today. We'll be right back.
The Trumpet Daily.
I want to take you now to a quote from The Plain Truth. This goes back to 1984, and this is basically just a snapshot of most of the 20th century. The author here says, in the 1930s, economic depression descended upon the world. The Great Depression was caused by human greed for profits at the expense of others, for gain beyond that which was honestly produced and earned. And then it says, World War II intervened and temporarily lifted some nations from economic depression. But the curse of war ripped men from their families. Here he's just talking about the impact, the massive social impact of something like World War. It says, and wives, for the first time, in great numbers, flocked to work outside the home to aid the war effort. A post-World War II pattern was set for unprecedented numbers of mothers to leave their homes and children for jobs and careers, leaving more and more children lacking in proper maternal instruction and discipline. Now that's just the reality. They left for the workforce during those war years, and then when the wars ended, they continued working outside the home. And what happens on a widespread scale? What happens to our society, to our families, to our children, when you see these kinds of massive social changes? Well, together with that, there were other movements in the 20th century, the rise of feminism, the modernist religious movement. Mr. Armstrong in The Missing Dimension talks about how that when those moral barriers were toppled, the clergy, the ministers, religion, they didn't do anything about it. They didn't stand up for the truth of God. They didn't fight for biblical morality. They didn't fight to keep the world out of the churches. They allowed the world to come in, worldliness. And that didn't help. And you have, together with that, the spread of German rationalism in education. And look at where we are today. Just look at one proverb to take one example. In the 1950s or 60s, I forget the exact year, but the writings of Benjamin Spock, they were received in academia. And of course, he was all about, and this followed right in the line of Sigmund Freud, free expression, no discipline. No discipline. Look at what this proverb says. Proverbs 29 and verse 15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. Discipline. Discipline, it says. It brings wisdom. And yet if you just leave your child to roam, to just do his own thing or do her own thing, it brings shame on the family. Well, many of you are familiar with the so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s and just the breakdown of the family. Moral relativism, value relativism, today political correctness run amok, and all of the statistics and the trends regarding family, children born out of wedlock, the number of children aborted every year, millions. The spread of divorce, what a curse that has been to our families. And then added to that, because of all of the sexual promiscuity, the spread of disease, AIDS and STDs. And here we are today with just about every kind of deviant sexual behavior. It's not only accepted, it's applauded. It's applauded. Let me take you to another passage. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. You think this kind of instruction would be received well today? Even in churches? Would they accept this? 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 14, it says, does not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame to him? Paul says, look, you should see this even in nature. That if he has long hair, it's a shame. That's a shame. That's New Testament. It's right out of 1 Corinthians. Verse 15 says, but if a woman have long hair, it's a glory to her, for her hair is given for her a covering. It's a glory for a woman to look that way, and it's a shame. It's a shame for a man to look that way. I'm just giving you what the Bible says, that's all. You could just read it in your own King James version of the Bible, or any version for that matter. Verse 16, let me just read that in Moffat. It says, if anyone presumes to raise objections on this point, well, I acknowledge to no other mode of worship, and neither do the churches of God. You can disagree if you want to, Paul says, but look, there's no other mode of worship. This is the truth. This is God's perspective. Let me give you a quote from one of our articles at the Trumpet. As I said, make sure you subscribe to the Trumpet. But this is in the Trumpet magazine from back in 2016. American morality is transforming. We'll use America now as the example. Where will it be 5 years from now? It progressed from the traditional Judeo-Christian family to the non-religious family, to the dysfunctional family, to the divorced and remarried family, to the fornicator, to the adulterer, to the homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, transsexual, transgender. Is that where it ends, or is there more transformation to come? Well, what do you suppose the answer is to that question? Are they satisfied, those pushing those agendas? Or are they still going to demand more change in the direction of deviance? It always goes in that direction. Let's just conclude over in 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 3. And you see, if this isn't proof, what we've seen over the past century. 1 full century of the new morality. That's what they called it in the 1960s. It's new. It's better because, well, if it's new, it has to be better. Is it better? Well, look around you. Look at what God says. This is verse 1 of 2 Timothy 3. This know also that in the last days perilous or dangerous times shall come. For men, verse 2, shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy. That's God's description. That's how God characterizes our society. For men shall be lovers of their own selves. They're just concerned about themselves. Radical individualism. Me first. That's the thinking. Verse 3. Without natural affection. Truce breakers. False accusers. Incontinent or lacking in discipline. Self-control. Fierce despisers. Despisers of those that are good. They despise those who would come along and say, well, hey, what about the biblical morality? What about what God says? What about what nature even shows us or teaches? They don't want to hear it. Despise those that are good. Verse 4 says, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. There was a time when we used to love the Bible, when commentators could write something and just assume that the readers were familiar with the Bible. Well, those days are long gone. Those days are long gone. One more quote here from The Missing Dimension in Sex. He says, bear in mind, the present world in revolt is in rebellion against much more than pre-20th century sex repression, and the modern downward spiral of humanity involves a much wider area than sex alone. In other words, as I said earlier, we're living in a world in revolt. It's in rebellion against God's truth. It's hostile to the truth of God. Romans 8:7. It wants nothing whatever to do with biblical morality. We have rejected that, top to bottom. Isaiah 1 says there's a sickness. It goes from the head to the tips of our toes. And this is why. Because we've gotten away from this biblical morality. Verse 5 here in 2 Timothy 3, it says, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. Don't even associate with it. Just turn away from this kind of living. It's hard to do when it's all around you. But this is what God expects. One last quote. He says, since this is just to emphasize how dangerous this is, this movement, where we are now after a century of this, since it's a basic truism that a solid family structure is the foundational bulwark of any stable and permanent society, this fact means only one thing. Civilization as we know it is on the way down and out unless that great unseen strong hand from someplace soon intervenes and saves today's sick society. We need God's intervention, and that intervention is coming. Equip yourself with this wonderful literature, The Missing Dimension in Sex, and then these two booklets, Character in Crisis, No Freedom Without Law. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Trumpet. Make sure that you do that today as well. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.